Okay, so we're live on YouTube now, and I want to welcome the YouTube participants. It's great to have you here, and thanks for being a part of our program tonight. As you can see, we're about 6 minutes before the beginning of the program. You'll see the countdown timer on the screen there to, no, you don't. I should share that so you can see it, because that's always helpful. Here, let me put that up, and now you can see the countdown timer. And that'll give you a sense of when we're about to start. So have a look at that. You will hear us chit-chatting away, and we're just trying to make sure that one of our presenters, Clyde, gets his audio sorted out. So if you're coming in and watching the recording before we've had the chance to edit out the chit-chat, use the scroll bar on Zoom just to move through the first 6 minutes or so that you don't have to suffer the chit-chat that we're doing.
This first slide reminds me that every week now I'm trying to figure out what's the next number. Has it really been 7 of these that we've been doing? I know it was March sometime.
I'm just putting a date on these. I'm not I'm not numbering them because I know I'll get mixed up.
Yeah, no, well, you know, it says something for how quickly all of this has evolved, because I mean, it's settled down a little bit now, but even today, the CRA updated all their frequently asked questions for the 75% program. So,
really?
You know, and it's not like they can announce that. You have to get that through, you know, professional sources and whatever. But it's you know, there's so many. All the law firms now have a newsletter daily. The accounting firms and so on, and they more or less say the same thing. And we're obviously trying to, in some cases, make that a little more accessible, I guess, with what we're describing here. And we're certainly trying to make it more church and congregation and ministry specific.
That's what I'm really appreciating. You know, I am not a church treasurer, but I'm a church guy. And the way that you're framing this helps those of us who are not bookkeepers understand what we need to do. And I feel so much more confident talking to my church treasurer because I've been here every Wednesday night.
Well, and this is a first. I can say that in large measure, last week's webinar is not out of date.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, that's literally the first time in the you know, in the 6 weeks that's been true. And you know, we're at the stage now where I guess we're pulling the trigger on a lot of this stuff.
Sure. Well, the programs have been established, and now we need to make sure that we know how we're using them properly. But for the first several weeks, you just kept telling us what was happening. Clyde, can you say something now to us?
I can say something if you can hear me.
Excellent.
I can hear you.
Excellent.
And my heart has suddenly slowed down 10 notches. I imagine yours has too.
So I'm using the phone.
Okay. You may need to pull the phone a little closer to your mouth when you talk to us, because it is a little soft. Sorry about that.
Okay. I can hold it. That's not a problem.
That's great. Well, only when you're talking. I mean, if your arm gets tired, let Eric do the talking.
That's great. Okay.
He's good at it. So friends on YouTube, there's about 2 minutes left to go before we're ready to start. So again, we're just chit-chatting away, and we'll begin right at the top of the hour. I need to put my phone on silent here so that it doesn't go off in the middle of our. So I'm presuming that I am moving the slides along again, gentlemen. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
Yes.
No. Last week, I think Clyde wanted to do it himself, but I'm
Yeah.
happy to do this, and I've gotten here ready to go. So
Okay, no, that's great. And yeah, no, we have a fair bit of news tonight in terms of how to do stuff and to clarify, but we're at the stage now where I'm hoping we can field some questions, and I'm also trying to line up a few folks who can potentially, literally do some hand holding or some online consulting while folks are working on their thing. Right now, Clyde and I have been trying to field those questions as they come into us.
sure.
But that's a bit challenging from a volume perspective.
Challenging for you to answer them. It's challenging even for me to assemble them.
Well, it's time for the big reveal for tonight.
Oh, there we go. Good show.
It is the Canada emergency, this, that, and the other thing that we're talking about after all. So you folks are going to get the Canada shirt for, until somebody, sends me something suitable to replace it.
Excellent. Well, we're glad you're wearing your Canada shirt, Eric. That's
Yeah. And there have been a few requests for me never to wear that Winnipeg Jets thing again.
I didn't realize this was a fashion show. Are you trying to make a point of wearing a different shirt every week?
Well, we've tried to honor different parts of the country, certainly.
Oh, got it. So
Yeah.
when we run out of shirts, then we'll end the series. Is that what
That's
you're
it.
telling me?
Okay, so
I think it's time to begin. So friends, welcome. My name is Stephen Feder. I manage the United Learning Program for the General Counsel Office. And it is, once again, a pleasure and a delight to be connecting with you from one coast to the other and all the way up to the north. Thank you for joining us. And we're delighted that you keep signing in and continue to find these programs helpful. It's a lot of work to pull this together, and yet it's important work, and it's important to be able to connect as folks who are worried about the financial mission of the church, to ensure that we're all doing things with consistency and with grace. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to Eric and Clyde, who have worked so hard to pull these things together. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Eric, who will open us. Eric.
Great. Good evening, folks, or good late afternoon, depending on where you are. As you know, our custom is to just take a second. I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement from where I'm broadcasting, and I think, and Clyde, most of this would apply to Clyde with a couple of slight variations out in Scarborough. But just to acknowledge that the land where I'm broadcasting from is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So that's the official Toronto acknowledgement, but if you just take a moment to know, and not necessarily for the chat box, but just to reflect on your part of the world for a second, and to perhaps reflect on the fact that through all this crisis, Mother Earth is, kind of enjoying some respite from some of what we inflict on her. So with that, maybe we'll move to the next slide, which will also be familiar to regular viewers. I always start the finance presentations with this because it's one of my favorite things to say to treasurers when they call me with a problem, just to say you are not alone. Almost always there are other folks in the country wrestling with the same issue, and hopefully we can bring our collective best here to solving the challenges that face our local church and frankly, church more broadly. Next slide, please. So what we're covering tonight, just a couple of little reminders. I'm still getting people calling in on some of this. So there is no news yet on the rental program. The rental program right now is literally called a commercial rent program. And I am hearing that there has been a fair bit of lobbying, and there may be some desire to expand this program that in a way that might include churches, but that is not the case today. And similarly, the $40,000, what are called small business loan programs, which have been immensely popular for small business, we're not eligible for those either. And I don't know that there necessarily will be any movement on that, but I do know that some people are still trying to lobby for that. I want to highlight one thing today. I want to make sure there's no confusion. Well, there will be confusion, but we have about almost 1,100 pastoral charges out of something like 1,700 signed up for the automatic processing. And I'll give you some information tonight that will hopefully persuade some others, but we are planning to do one further mailing to invite as many of you and as many others as possible to sign up for this. And I'll speak to that just a little bit. So tonight, the main focus, though, will be tools and tips for, they're starting to use acronyms now, choose and cues. The 10% program is well underway, and last week, the applications open for the 75%. So we've learned a little bit. I know I've done some application work. I think Clyde has too. And I know many of you are working on it or may have already submitted. And of course, just want to, again, to the extent we can, help people through using these online tools, because frankly, this world is online, and that's just the way it is going to be. And it may be a challenge for some of us, but I do see us, this leapfrogging our capability as we move forward. And this disclaimer is copied from PricewaterhouseCoopers, but every law firm and accounting firm that offers information says this now. Information is accurate as at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time today. Information may be affected by subsequent announcements. So stay tuned is what we're saying. Next slide. So I'm pleased to say that the mea culpa list is getting shorter. Just want to highlight the fact that we are giving generic revenue advice. The guidance from the CRA, which references the Income Tax Act, is pretty generic, and particularly around definitions of extraordinary revenue and so on. Some language was added today. Do have a look at it, and we'll speak to it a little bit. But my advice here is be consistent in your approach, and have an apples to apples basis. Write down what your assumptions were, and do it in good faith, and you should be okay. One change that isn't actually a change. I've been telling everyone to do the 10% calculation. I've been encouraging you to sign up with ADP, which many of you have done. But it turns out the 75% calculation needs the 10% calculation to be done. So you will need to grab that spreadsheet, even though ADP is doing a calculation for you. And I'm going to show you how long it can take to get this processing and why you want ATP to do it. It wouldn't be unusual to take 4 or 5 or 6 months to get the full 10% rebate, depending on what your payroll structure looks like. And we'll be trying to explain that in an comprehensible way this evening. Next slide. So here's just a quick recap of the various programs. So this is almost more to have the slide in the deck for folks who weren't on this call. The Canada Emergency Business Account isn't available to us for the reasons stated here. There's still some debate on whether that was intentional or not, but that's the law of the land as of about 20 minutes ago when I last looked it up on the CRA website. Next slide, please. Similarly, the Canadian or Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance doesn't work for us yet either. It basically is targeted at folks who have mortgage financing on properties, and the word commercial is extensively used. We are receiving assurances. We have a number of people across the country lobbying on this, and Kendra Fry from Trinity St. Paul's is one of those folks. And if there's any news on that, if there's any news by next week, she would be on the call with us to report any news. But at this stage, nothing yet. Next slide. So far we're talking about what we're not talking about. Again, just for completeness, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, of course, is the $2,000 amount payment for every 4 weeks, up to 16 weeks. It sort of supplements, replaces, and frankly is way better than EI for many people with smaller part-time arrangements. These are changes that have been made in the past few weeks. I list them here just for completeness. Next slide. So again, this is a repeat. Just to remind folks, if you're coming on for the first time or whatever, we're hoping, we are recommending that anyone contemplating a layoff contact their region to make sure that they have the province-specific employment language in any paperwork. We're hoping that as we now are promised the 75% wage subsidies for eligible people, that might take some of the pressure off. But we also note that many part-time and shorter-term arrangements, people will be better off or might make more money in the short run being laid off. So those are local decisions to be considered. I want to stress that core group benefits for this is now for employees who are currently on the benefit plan would continue during a short-term layoff, and this would be funded by the national church through the finances of the group benefit plan. There can also be arrangements to maintain pension payment contributions to the pension plan by the individual. One more slide on old stuff, and then we'll dive into the new. We've talked before about the need to work with the record of employment, and the fastest way to do this is on Service Canada. We have a webinar on this. I think the slide may be out of date. It wasn't yesterday, it was a week ago, but on United in Learning, we have a webinar that Clyde has done on how to do this. And we'll move to the next slide. Clyde, maybe could you speak to this one? You're my guru on this.
I will gladly talk to this one. The first point that I've got here, if you sign up for Service Canada, even though you may not require an ROE at this point, it might be necessary tomorrow, whenever that is. So you're better off to get it signed up now. And I've heard from 3 different people who signed up for their Service Canada account, saw a spot there where they could switch to the CRA account as part of once they logged into their Service Canada, and it gave them access to their business account. Made it very simple for them. Now, I don't know all of the details that they went through first, but they said they got access to it. It's worth a try. It's good to have both signed up anyway. If you do have to sign up, I still suggest and recommend strongly that you go through Represent a Client. It's a lot easier. When you get to the form that where you request your authorization, down near the bottom of it, just above where you put the name in for who's going to sign it for you, put in that to change owner, and then provide a list of names of people that could be involved. And that is the T1235 form that you send in with your T3010. Put all of this together in a PDF file when you return the form once it's signed, and you can only go to a maximum of 4 pages in that file because the sizing is limited on returning it. And one quick negative point here, you do have to have your own income tax filings current in order to get access to a business account as a representative. And so the CRA, part of what they're doing is they check your social insurance number against their files so as to come up with a question about your latest tax filing. And if you haven't filed the last 2 years, it's going to bounce you right out of the system at that point. So they don't tell you what they've done, but that's exactly what's happening for it. So just make sure you've got your own taxes filed, and then you can move ahead on this. So that's a few comments on the sign-ups. We're still getting lots of questions, lots of people asking about it, and I've gladly filled them in as we go along.
Okay, and Clyde, I've had a number of people express concern about being asked for their social insurance number. They haven't even gotten to the part where they ask you about, a number on your tax return. But I've been trying to assure everyone that this is probably the highest or most secure question the CRA could ask in establishing. So it's in everyone's best interest, even though some folks might find it disconcerting at first.
Well, that's how they identify people, is with the social insurance number. And then the secondary check is the question, and they don't always ask about the same line of information from your notice of assessment from the last filing. And that's how they control who it is that has access to what. And they then know who they're talking to on this when you're remote like this. So I think it's wise. It's your account that you're setting up so that you can then access the business account. And I think it's good practice.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to move on to the next slide, and I see a couple of questions about the 10% rebate. We're going to be talking about that a fair bit after we talk about one more program in terms of update. We do have the $10,000 emergency loans for congregations from the General Counsel Office. This is money that is being made available through a grant from the foundation, and frankly, money that I'll be borrowing. We do envision it supplementing and being used potentially after the federal funding programs have been accessed, but there may be cases where you need to consider that now. The form is online. The application goes directly to the region for review. So just to say that that's completely live now, and a couple of features now on the next slide. So it's modeled after the famous SEBA loan that we're not eligible for from the government, but the idea being that it be interest-free for a period of time, that if the loan is paid off within that time frame, that up to $500 is forgiven. If you borrow the full $10,000, then it would be $500 forgiven. I've been asked, and if the loan is a lesser amount, then we would prorate the grant or refund elements as well. If you do need to continue with the loan, it would start to accrue interest, and working with the region, we'd figure out what kind of payment plan you would be aiming for. So that's the United Church Emergency Loan. And I think we're now getting to the new programs. So
okay, before you jump into that, Eric, there is a question from YouTube. Somebody's saying, now that we know that we're not eligible for the 40 grand from the government, any chance that you might up the amount on the United Church one?
There is discussion on that. I'm actually going to work with my region leaders team, the region executive ministers. The challenge, of course, is that just to give you a sense of scale, a $10,000 loan, 1,000 of those is $10 million, and so we're trying as much as possible to reach as many congregations as possible. But yes, it's under consideration. And I said this during the warm-up. So far, I've been saying every webinar preceding the one we're on is out of date. The April 29th one, where Clyde took us through the calculators and took us through some of the forms online, that one is substantially up to date. And we do hope that the rate of changes might be slowing down a bit. Okay, next slide. So it's really important. It's one thing to rely on the stuff that Clyde and I are saying, but the online tools that the government has made available here are really, really good. It's really important that if you're working, whichever elements you're working on, that you read through the frequently asked questions in particular, or the how-to. I think if we go back one there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I moved it on by mistake.
Yeah, no problem. It's really important, and particularly when you're applying for the 75%, it's really comprehensible and accessible, way more than, frankly, most government procedures that I've had to work with. They're really trying to be user-friendly. They're making decisions on the fly. They're updating it and improving it. So it's really important. And frankly, the calculators that are online is really what you need to work with. Next slide.
And just while we're doing that, let me say, I will pull out these links and put them on the landing page for the recording for tonight's webinar. So
okay, yes,
by
that
the
would be
time
great.
we're finished, you should be able to go and just click those links and get them if because I know you can't kind of run those, click them in the webinar, but they'll be there for on the landing page when you're ready.
That would be great. And if somebody wants to paste them into the chat box, that's always good too. So as I've said before, basically this 10% program is available to charities, and therefore, are basically, all or most of our congregations. We have had over 1,000, almost 1,100 now, folks sign up for to have this processing done for them by ADP in the national office. I want to say that I saw a couple of questions about have any rebates showed up. They haven't yet, but I have them. I saw them this afternoon to eyeball them and check myself, and all of them have been processed. So the 600 or so dating back to mid-March, when the March adjustments for folks who had March payrolls in the time period, and all of April, which is fully 1,100 more. I suspect that we will be signing off on that tomorrow. And depending on the time, depending on your bank, credit unions might be a little slower, but the payments should be showing up in your account possibly as early as Friday, but certainly early next week. And the delay is frankly at our end because we've wanted to check to make sure this works and the payments are coming through. Here's a key point. We think this is good enough now and tested that we want to offer it to the folks who missed the deadline. We had a firm deadline. We said you can't do it. ADP has agreed to create a second batch. It's very difficult to keep track of everything when you're just adding to the list. So we're going to do an email broadcast to all pastoral charges, probably tomorrow afternoon, and invite people to sign up who have not already. You can check though that list of all the ones that are all signed up and that are being processed now is online, and I'll have a reference for you in a couple of slides. So a few things. A, you can look to see if you're on the list to be processed. B, a second opportunity to get on the next list for this, and you'll see why I'm recommending it, because the way it's structured, you might have to do this for a number of months to max out your rebate. And again, obviously this service is only available for folks on ADP. On the same payroll website or web page at the National Church, we have the tools for anyone who's needing to do it themselves. These are obviously on the ADP side as well, but for folks who are needing to do it themselves, the tools are there on the payroll site. Next slide, please. So there's the web link. If you type payroll service, that's where all the elements are. there's a report called Report Change of Contact. I'll give it a better name by next week, but that's what it was called, and that's how it got posted. But that's where the 1,090 pastoral charges that are currently having their rebates processed and have signed up to have Eileen and team available to help if needed in future. That's where that is. We will be coming out to everybody. We could be trying to sort of segment a list and duplicates and so on, but we'd rather err on the side of getting the message out to everybody. So it's going to have some language that says, hey, if you're already signed up, you can check here, no action required. Sorry to bother you with another email. But we want to invite folks to have this opportunity to have the work done for them. And on this same page, each of the yellow highlighted elements is a document at the bottom of the page. Report Change of Contact is the list. The temporary wage subsidy worksheet is a spreadsheet that you use to calculate the subsidy. And the change form is what you would need to submit to ADP.
So what would be the deadline for that second batch, Eric?
We haven't established a deadline, but I think if we said, well, ADP has actually suggested the middle of May. So that would be, 9 days from here. If we made it May 15th, something like that. There is a fair bit of work in background. And frankly, there's even a fee for this work, which I am completely happy to pay, and is going to be covered from the national church. So no one has to worry about that. If they sign up, it will get taken care of. I believe this also positions us for the long run, where if you have a payroll problem, you've got someone who's authorized to look at it with you, as opposed to sort of have this third-party conversation. Next slide,
Eric,
please.
one quick question before we switch. So the temporary wage subsidy worksheet that you mentioned at the bottom, is that the ADP one?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's good, because that's a great tool.
Yeah. Well, it is, and it's very, very user-friendly. I played with it a little bit today, and in fact, I'm going to have some examples next on how it works.
And how do we find out if you received and processed the 10% claim?
Well, basically, if you signed up, if your name is on the list, you should be looking for it in your bank account. When this is done, like when the full credits each month have been processed, ADP will be giving us a list of everything they've done, a summary list, but they can't do it in between, because there's this rolling calculation that you'll see in just a minute. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to send it to everyone. Check to see if you're on the first list. Okay, of the 10 and it says here 1,000 subsidy payments imminent. It's actually 1,600. It's about 600 from March, and it's over 1,000 from April. Depending on when your payroll started, because the program obviously kicked in mid-March. And here's, if for those of you who are, just perhaps in better shape than others in terms of your revenues and everything else, you don't have to act now. The rules for this literally say that if you did nothing for the next 6 months, you could still claim this as an adjusting item when you file your T4 summary at the end of the year. Now, I don't know anyone that I've talked to who's going to go that path, but I'm just saying it's there. It's an automatic adjustment that you're allowed. The only reason for doing it now is you control it, and you can get money back without having to apply to anyone. You're just asking ADP to do it for you. Okay, next slide. So I'm picking a couple of examples here to make sure that people understand the logic, because if you're the smallest church and you have, say, a minister of, say you're big enough to have a full-time minister at that salary. By the way, I always pick numbers that divide by 12. just because I'm making them up on the fly. So this would be someone $60,000 gross wages would be $5,000 per month. That's how much it is per week if you divide by 52. The income tax, depending on their holdings and stuff, is somewhere in the realm of $1,200 per pay. And the eligible subsidy is $1,375. So if you're in this situation, it's going to take 3 months to get your full $1,375 because there's a limit, 10% of monthly wages. So the message here is, in the smallest place, it's still going to take a little time to get this because of the government rules and what you can only draw whatever money is in the income tax bucket. All the stuff for CPP and EI and so on needs to be fully remitted the way it always has been. So now let's move on and add another employee or a couple of employees. And this would be perhaps a slightly more common example in a small setting. The main message here is the $1,375 is per employee on payroll. That means someone that you're taking source deductions for, EI, CPP, employer portion, employee portion. So if we had a couple of part-time people making $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, then the payroll would be $7,000 per month. The income tax withheld is still only $1,200. I'm sort of doing that to make a point. The eligible subsidy, though, is 3 times as much. You get a subsidy per employee without any rules around whether they're full-time or part-time. So this will work and for a lot of our smaller settings where we do use part-time folks in a variety of roles. And of course, it doesn't work if you have folks off payroll, where, whether you're paying them through a T4A or a purchase of service arrangement. But in this case, and this isn't an unusual one, it'll take 6 monthly transactions, one each month by ADP, to process the maximum allowed amount to get to the full rebate that you're allowed. So the fact that you'd have to do this many transactions, as far as I'm concerned, is just another reason why you might want someone else to do that for you and just get a nice report at the end.
No, for sure.
Eric, if I could jump in on here one more time. The comment you've got right at the bottom about the maximum that can be taken per pay period is 10% of the monthly wages, or the maximum amount of what your income tax was withheld. It's whichever is lower.
Right.
Because sometimes the income tax is small, depending on the configuration of your employees.
That's right. And that's what I'm saying here with the $1,200. There's only one employee here who paid any income tax at all. And yet you've got to reach into that bucket for 3 people. So I hope that's helpful, because one of the things I'm going to stress is, so, hey, even if you're having ADP do this, you still need to know this calculation in order to do the 75% wage subsidy. The reason I'm harping on the 10 is everybody should get this. If you don't, it's just negligence. The 75, I don't yet have a handle on how widespread our eligibility is. But I am hearing from quite a number of people that they are eligible. I'm also hearing from a few folks who say they aren't. And then, of course, it's a matter of whether if you weren't eligible in March, you might be in April. Or if you weren't eligible in either of those 2 months, you still might be in May. So next slide, please. So this is Eric's ongoing advice. I would authorize ADP to do this. I have 2 reasons for that. 1, to get it off your plate. 2, it is in the best interest long run for every congregation to have improved backup on the payroll function. And this is a way of achieving that as well. If you're doing it yourself and you're doing it on ADP, and there are very capable payroll experts out there who happen to be church volunteers, hey, full speed ahead, keep doing what you're doing. If, as we've come to learn over the last few weeks, there's employees not on ADP, you're going to have to do that separately. You should use the ADP calculator, which is available to you. And my advice continues to be, why would you do two or three different ways? And I know some of the answers. I know that, if there's changes you don't want to make too many transactions on ADP, but by the same token, it's biting you right now. So a key point, I've said it twice, I'll say it a third time. When you're doing the 75% subsidy calculation, one of the tools you should bring into the mix is the 10% calculator that we talked about, and we've shown you where it is. Next slide. So we're going to take a little break here and just make sure we're up to date on any questions that have come in.
And I would say, yes, we are. I've kind of stopped you along the way, but you've answered the ones that have come in, so that's great.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, I'm looking here at a couple of the Zoom questions. Karen's asking, how do you find out if you received and processed our claim? The answer is look it up on the list. The list is everybody we're basically going to be sending payments out on in the next little while.
And that list is on the United Church page. We gave you the link earlier.
That's right. And then from YouTube, Julia's asking, do we need to worry about the temporary subsidy worksheet? And the answer is yes, as one of the last steps in finalizing your 75%. If you're not eligible for the 75% and you've authorized ADP, you're done.
Last week you told us to estimate it, and that's what my church did. Probably others did too.
Yeah,
we should go back and revise it, or
well, no. If you've applied, that number could probably hold. I'm just saying that if you want it to be precise, because the challenge with this is the 10% we're going to get, but we don't know whether each month we're going to be eligible for the 75%. So the government is saying how much of the 10% subsidy relates to March or the first 4 weeks and so on. So we'll get to that in a little more detail in just a second.
Okay.
But an estimate is not going to get you in trouble because it's theoretically it should be close. In fact, it should be pretty exact. The only issue is timing. Any other questions out there?
Haven't seen any others come in, Eric. So
okay.
I would say just carry on.
Okay. So we're going to move on now to the 75%. So again, the website is excellent. We're going to highlight quickly some of the high level stuff, the time frames and stuff. This is something that we've been harping on for a few weeks. So if I'm going too fast, or if Clyde, when Clyde jumps in with, if we're going too fast, you can just slow us down with some questions. Next slide, please. So again, this is just a recap of what it provides, and the whole business around, whether some businesses are doing this with some regularity, where they're claiming the full 75% subsidy and not paying people. Our philosophy is, if you have someone working full time, we should try to pay them full time. But again, you have to make your decisions locally. But be aware that if you're making any changes to the terms of employment, be very aware of your employment law situation in the province. Check with your region. Beth Symes has been aboard a few times to remind us that with certain jobs you could be contravening provincial standards that could get you in trouble. Next slide. So we've listed the ways to apply, but the main message for this slide today is it's only online. So if we can get that My Business account working, great. If you're already set up with Represent a Client or can get set up, the government is certainly deploying extra resources to accommodate that. But the if you can't get either of those done in a reasonable time frame, then there is this web access application where you ask for a web access code, and that would be a first step in moving you forward. Next slide, please. So we've talked about revenues and the definition of revenue, just highlighting what we've talked about before. Today, the government expanded their frequently asked questions and added a bunch of stuff about revenue. It's still a gray area, particularly as it relates to extraordinary items versus what is regular operations from a church. But as a reminder, we've taken a couple of positions. We've felt that bequests, although they're infrequent, are a normal income possibility for a church. So we probably need to include those. We've talked about excluding mission and service or donations to another charity if they're 100% flow through, and excluding non-cash investment gains and losses. This is your investment, your endowment fund or your investment fund popping up and down the way it has the last few months. That doesn't count, and that was clarified again today by the CRA. What would count would be any cash income if you were cashing in a GIC and there was an interest income that came with that. Or if there was a regular interest payment or a regular dividend check that you cash, those should be included. Next slide. So extraordinary items, it's very clear that sale proceeds are an extraordinary item. It isn't as clear that where capital campaigns stand. As I've mentioned I've asked finance officials this a few different times. A focused capital campaign for a new initiative is not. It can be considered by most an extraordinary item, but you have to be careful because there are lots of places, my own included, that invite, say, a regular contribution to the building fund. That can't be extraordinary. That's just normal stewardship. So we have to watch for that. Some questions we've had this week: capital assistance grants, which are come from the national office, but could come from other church bodies, and faithful footprints grants for energy efficiency enhancements. We're taking the view that these are very one-time items, and they're also from non-arm's length church bodies. So we think there's a solid argument for excluding those. Also had some questions about the UCW. Excuse me. And the first test on this is always how separate is your UCW. If you consolidate UCW results on a T3010, then I would argue that their revenue should be included. If, as in the case of my UCW, where at least they used to before they disbanded, if they offered tax receipting, then that too would mean that they should be included in the revenues. So if either of those is yes, definitely include. If you think there's a compelling argument that they're entirely separate, you should do that. I've never been trying not to sneeze on national TV before. Next slide, please. So we're definitely in. We've reminded people it's the loss of 15% in March. And you have a choice of comparing to either prior year March or the average of the first 2 months in 2020. There's been additional language added to the FAQ by the CRA today, and basically they're saying be consistent. You can't bounce back and forth to try to qualify. Be consistent and be very thorough in documenting your choices. Next slide, please. So we've had a lot of questions, and again, it's been clarified today, and it's in the FAQ. If you read the legal document, the attestation, you could construe it another way, but the government is saying that if you qualified in March, you automatically qualify in April. full stop. You don't need to do a revenue test in April. You would need to do a revenue test again and certify in May. So the key message here is that they're trying to do that for administrative purposes and also to try to get help out to people, but be consistent in the calculation. I've seen a number of cases where people had some generous stewardship responses in April. The revenue could be level or even up. You're still eligible for the wage subsidy if you were for the March test, but you would need to reapply and in May again, or you would need to remeasure in May and meet the 30% decrease at that time. And there are various, additional technical rules where you need to have been on, employees, if they weren't already off, they count, that kind of thing. There's a lot of detail in the FAQ if you have specific questions. Next slide, please.
Just a quick comment there on the 14 days without working. If somebody's working even 15 minutes, I've understood that it's got to be excluded because they're not considered 14 days without work.
And Clyde, is that measured by being paid?
No, if they're without work for 14 days, that does not include anybody who might pop into the church to pick up the mail.
So again, what I would take away from this, folks, is that there's there's some gray in here. Yep. And the most important thing you could do, and I think as a church we need to do and be seen to do, is treating this program in a very good faith way in terms of what we're measuring, what we're documenting, and what we're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide, please. So again, this is re-emphasizing the test period. Okay, if you meet the 15% test in March, you don't retest in April. If you didn't meet in March, you test in April. You need to meet the new higher standard. And even if you fail the first 2 months, but there's still a possibility for a claim for the May results. So if you might be getting sick of me saying this, but be consistent in revenue definitions and document rationale for all inclusions and exclusions. And then frankly, you should be okay.
And so if you don't have to retest in April, but you would come back and retest in May?
Yeah, well, basically what I say retest is to measure if you're eligible. If you're not eligible, you're not eligible, but don't just give up. Okay, if you didn't meet the test, if you didn't meet the test in March, don't give up, measure it again in April. If you didn't meet the test in either of those months, don't give up, measure it again in May.
Sure.
Next slide, please. And I'll go over these quickly, but this is the whole business around our pastoral change. This is for our charge structure, and this is for multiple point situations. All of this is predicated on payroll number. And in a pastoral, in a multi-point situation, we often have a payroll number that looks like an orphan to the CRA because it's different from any of the underlying charities. And so what we're saying is that you're going to need to consolidate financials one way or another. On the next slide, if you have a pastoral charge where the charitable status is at the pastoral charge level, then you're good to go. You're already consolidating your financials for the CRA. You're already measuring, you're adding up your revenues that way. And the payroll number, the RP number, is presumably the same as your charitable number. So your 10% claim is straightforward. Your 75% claim is straightforward, typos aside, if you're eligible. On the next slide, if you have a situation where the underlying churches are points are the charity, and the pastoral charge is largely a payroll service and perhaps certain other shared costs, the recommendation is that there's language in the guidelines that say you could treat that as one entity from a payroll perspective, and the adverse impact if your revenues have dropped. So this is one where you would need to consolidate the financials of the points to determine if you're eligible. If you're eligible for 75, then you move on. If you're not eligible, you just claim that the 10% off your payroll anyway, and call it a day. Okay, next slide. So it is processed at the RP or payroll number level, and so some of you, myself included at the national office, I have a couple of RP. I have RP 0001, I have RP 0002, and therefore my filing, there'd be a filing for each of those based on the employees that are under each of those. You need to do a separate version of the CRA online calculator, and I can't stress this calculator is great. Clyde walked us through it last week. It's fairly, again, compared to most CRA things, it's built to be used by volunteers as well as accounting professionals. So it's relatively user-friendly, but it does have this goofy aspect of not accommodating monthly wages. So, we have to convert things into weeks. And again, where you have some people on ADP and some not, the first test will be what your RP number structure looks like. If you're doing all of that under the same RP number, then you're going to be smushing together two bunches of data, to use a technical term. And if you have different RP numbers, then you'll do a different calculation base for that. So next slide. So what is eligible compensation? The answer is basically gross wages is basically everything that's taxable. In our land, in church land, the one thing that we can't really, in good conscience, claim is Box 30 amounts and Manse allowances. For those situations, there isn't cash being paid. We're not out cash. So that would be excluded because it's also adjusted for at income tax time and for that matter for CPP contributions. So that's one example of something that isn't included. Otherwise, virtually all other Box 14, items that go into Box 14 would be counted. So I want to keep hyping the calculator that's online for the CEW, the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy. It works really well. As I say, Clyde took us through it. It's essential that you do that work. And maybe we'll go to the next slide. And Clyde, you can, while I'm coughing here, you could maybe run with it a bit.
In the calculator, they actually give you 3 different ways of calculating situations where somebody's earning more than the $1129.33 a week, or they earn less, and whether they're getting a pay reduction or no pay reduction. And it's just helpful information there. So let's just move on. I'm just going to highlight a few things as we go through these next few slides. Calculating the values, use the spreadsheet. It is really good, and it's been said a number of times tonight, but it does work. Monthly salaries, you take the calculation of multiplying it by 12 divided by 52, and you've got your weekly salary. If you've got an employee with flexible hours, it's a lot more complex, and you would have to come in with some pretty specific calculations to figure out what the weekly equivalent would be. And that will depend on what you can claim in each of the 4 weeks within each period. But we work everything on the basis of a week salary, and so that's what we have to work down to. Yes, when you've done the calculator, it moves the totals over to the instruction and results page, and you need to note those 3 numbers because that's used elsewhere. Okay, next slide.
And Clyde, maybe I'll mention, maybe I'll just mention, because lots of folks miss this. This calculator and spreadsheet has multiple tabs, which you can see at the bottom. So there's a summary page tab where all your numbers roll up, and then there's a tab for each of the worksheets that you choose to use.
Yeah, and that's pay period 1, pay period 2, pay period 3. They really work it up for you in a good way. Anyway, the results are there, and you copy them into 2C in the required fields, and it just starts populating down. And as you finish each step, it gives you a picture of the results that are showing there as to what or a summary of what you've put in. Your premiums and contributions, the 100% refund of the employer portion of the EI premiums or the CPP contributions. This is only for employees who are furloughed with full or partial remuneration, and they cannot work at all in that period, even though they're being paid. And this is another point where I was advised recently that even 15 minutes of somebody going in to pick up the mail and sort it and do what they do with it can jeopardize this possibility here.
Yeah.
Then sorry,
Clyde, I'll just mention that, and this is something that you need to have said and done up front. You can't say, oh, I can get an extra 6%, 6% here. You need to have said that to the employee up front, that they were basically not going to be doing any work. In the case of the national office, for example, we announced very explicitly that we were going to work remotely, and we have, people took their laptops and whatever. We can't very well go back and say, well, there's some people that might not be working. It needs to have been set up front.
That's right, and the boxes are very clearly marked as to what you want to put in them. Like they combine the EI and the QPIP, if it's applicable, and the same with the CPP and QPP. So we'll go on to the next slide. The deductions for this time period, and this is where your 10% for the temporary wage subsidy comes in. And the assumption is that you have claimed it. So it is looking for a dollar value in there. Now, in one of the ones that I worked through, there was no pay period. So it wasn't actually paid or claimed in the time frame that was given. So the assumption was made that we didn't pay the employee, so there was no TWS for that period. And so we put in 0 and found that it worked, even though the notes indicated that it would not likely work. But that's just one of the things that you should be aware of, is you claiming what you've already collected in TWS. In future, we're going to be able to pull the numbers from what comes back into our bank account. Make sure you account for everything over the 4 periods or over the 3 periods that we're dealing with. And then you'll get your results from that. And again, that's summarized in a page, and they tell you right there to print it, because they're the numbers that you're going to need when you're doing your application. And they all come out in exactly the same order as what the application calls for. So it makes it very easy for completing the application. On to the next slide, if we would, please. Before you apply, you make sure your business details are all in. If you've got direct deposit, that would be good. If for some reason you're not on direct deposit and you don't wish to be, then there will be a check issued, but it might take a few extra days or maybe even weeks before it gets to you. But make sure that you've got everything there for the RP account, and that you're using the right account number when you do your application. And you have the results that we just spoke about from the calculation. Next slide. When you go to apply for the CEWS, sign into My Business account if you have the direct access, represent a client for representatives, or sign into web form application. If, whichever one you're doing, there will be an attestation when you're finished, just before you hit enter to submit the application. And it varies depending on which one of the situations you're using. So you've got the My Business one, which has got some specific wording for people that are doing it for their own business. There's a different one for somebody who's representing a client, and there's a third kind for the web forms. The represent a client also requires an attestation form to be signed by the business owner. So let's go on to the next point. Next slide will show the first half of that. It's a form RC661E, and you can only get it at the time you're submitting the application. So if you're doing it through represent a client, make sure you print it off or complete it right there online and then print it, because it is a fillable form. You can, all the first part one is general. If you can match all of those or recognize all of them and you can say yes to them, then you're good to go. The next slide will show us the part two, and this is where you're making some elections for different things. So if we can move to the slide. The elections part two. The box, there's 7 different boxes there. Each one's a different type of election. 3 of them, 1, 2, and 4, may apply to multi-point charges, and it depends on how you're set up and how you are reporting. Box 3 deals with joint ventures, which none of us are involved in, so leave that one blank at all times. If you are planning to use the cash method throughout the whole process of this subsidy, then you will check off box 5 because you've elected to use it. Otherwise, you're using accrual method, and that's standard, so you don't need to check it. The concerns prior reference period, what this is dealing with is if you are comparing month to month, like March to March, March 19 to March 20, and the same with April and then May, then you don't need to make this election. But if you elect to change your prior reference period to the January, February of 2020 to compare to the months, then you need to check off that you've elected this prior reference period adjustment. And the box 7 is if you're telling it that you're going to exclude any government funding that you may have received. So some churches do get government funding for different projects that they're carrying out, and so they want to make sure that that's excluded from the process. Then you check box 7. The employer, there's one more box, but it's in part B, is if the employer has not made any of the above elections. So if you're leaving all 7 boxes blank, then check the box that's under B. And then you've got the attestation statements. You enter the amount that's on line H of your application and then sign it with your title. The thing that I found interesting is this form does not have a place for the date. So I'm recommending that you just write the date on it somewhere down near the signature line. But make sure the date is within a day or so of when the actual application was made, because it's supposed to be done as part of the online process. It's a little awkward in my case where I'm doing them for different clients. I would have to process it through, and then I have to take it and get them to sign it after the fact. So a couple of days isn't going to matter a lot with it, but it's a way of making sure. And you will need to do this every time you apply for the subsidy. It doesn't say to do different ones, but my suggestion is that you figure on doing a different one for each of the 3 periods. Okay, move on to the next if we could. After you apply, deposits are expected to start on May the 6th. I did get word that May 6th, today they did start running it. And so checks could take significantly longer, but the money is on its way to many bank accounts. When you do your T3010 for 2020, so we're talking a year from now, this would be included on line 4540 of Schedule 6 on your T3010 form. And T4 will have 3 boxes in the other information area at the bottom of the T4. And all they're saying at this point in time is that details for this will become known before the end of the year. So they haven't decided exactly what you're going to get in the way of reporting, but we know that it's going to be by employee. We must keep all records for audit purposes, and fraudulent claims, I was told a week ago it was about 25% of the return amount as a fine, but most recent it's being said that it's between 25 and 50%, and if it is totally fraudulent, it could involve jail time. I do not expect that from any of the ones that we're doing, because they will look at it and say they understand who's dealing with this process. I think they're looking at the kind of accounting firms that they have problems with regularly anyway. And that's where they're going to keep a record on that one. So make sure you keep your records. That's important. Next slide. And there we are for questions. How are we doing?
Okay, and I'm just working the chat box here a little bit. So, from John Wilson on YouTube, what was the point of the email from ADP concerning Choose? I thought that was being done automatically. Yeah, ADP can only do something. Basically, what you were doing if you responded to that email, was authorizing ADP to work with the General Counsel office to do that on your behalf. So we're signing off. ADP can't do any transaction without the express authority of the church, the company. So the whole idea there was for you to delegate that responsibility to the General Counsel office, Eileen and the payroll team, and then ADP as a service accommodation for us was offering to do the calculations and for us to check them. So that's what we're doing there. I see a couple of questions about no sign of the rebate. I spoke to that earlier. As I say, I've seen something on the level of 1,700 or so transactions that we'll be signing off on. We may have already signed off on late today, but certainly tomorrow, and then ADP processes them the same day. They take a day or two potentially to work through the bank system. Banks, you'll see it sooner. If you're with a credit union, it might be just a little slower because they have some more manual back office processes.
There's a number of different questions, Eric, about the idea that if you apply, it's about the 75% wage subsidy, and if you qualify in March, you don't have to qualify in April. But if you don't qualify in March, then you apply in April. Do you have to apply again in May? Or does one application cover 2 months in a row, or how does this work? Just clarify
yes,
that.
Basically, it's what you said, Steve. So if you get a free pass, if you will, on the following month. So if you qualified in March, you automatically qualify in April, and would need to re-measure your threshold and then for May to May. And that was another question. You're comparing either May of the current year. Oh, here's my beverage arriving. It's that time.
Hurry up with the questions, folks.
It's supposed to be 8:10. It is 8:10. But specifically, the whole idea is that I've lost my train of thought.
So once you've applied,
when you pass the test, you get a free pass the next time.
but then
And
you
you
have to
are
apply on
comparing the actual month. So if it's say May of 2020, you're either comparing it to the average of the Jan-Feb of this year, or you're comparing it to prior year May. And you need to be consistent with that approach. Whichever approach you take, you can't change it mid go.
And when is does the application open for period 2 or for period 3?
Well,
Right now.
yeah, the time needs to pass. It basically, the first one, obviously they were waiting to get set up, but period 2, you can go as soon as you have the numbers. As soon as you have your, if you qualified in March, then as soon as you have your April numbers, you could apply. If you didn't qualify in March, you're still taking a test to see if you do. But
Right.
but basically, you could go pretty soon.
Well, you got to wait another week or so, because the 4-week period starts April 12th and runs through to May, and I don't remember the exact date of it.
Yeah.
So you have to wait till after that pay period to make sure
Yeah.
that the salary or the payments didn't change on the payroll.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
But I mean, you can be ready to go right now, because in most cases, our payroll won't have changed. So I'm looking at some other questions here. Judy here, the next deadline, I think we've answered that, May 15th for the second batch of people, where we are expressly encouraging folks to sign on with ADP. There's a couple of questions here about the 10%, and if we use the estimate. There's 2 ways to go. I would really, and this was on the mea culpa list, I would encourage people to take a look at that calculator. It's really, really easy, and most of you have relatively few employees, so it might be 5 or 10 minutes work. If you did use a number that turns out to be incorrect or an estimate, you can adjust next time. The main thing the government wants to do here is make sure that you aren't getting more than the 75%. There can be adjustments along the way. If you're a large employer, you might have taken your entire allowable amount in the first go, because it was $25,000.
If I can jump in on the next one here, Vivian had some questions and Ray followed along with it. The RC 661 form is not filed. It is kept with your working papers, so that if there's an audit, you know that somebody in authority within the charity has signed off agreeing with what you filed. The fact that it doesn't get filed with the application, you keep it. Somebody says here that they applied and don't recall completing it, but they made an attestation of their own. If they filed as a represent a client, right back where you check that box, represent a client, there's a place there where the form is available, and you have to click on that to get the form actually up. And it is different than the form that you've done as the representative when you do the application. It's a little more entailed to it. So make sure you go back and pick that form up. You can do it now. Go into that point in the process and just print the form off. And then, well, the third one was much along the same lines. So good. I think I've answered or attempted to answer those questions.
Okay, and I just want to make sure we're testing, we're covering as many folks as we can here. I'm seeing George, Isaac, and others. You're comparing the same month. So you're comparing May to May, April to April, March to March, if you're using the prior year method. And that's that one. Ralph Moulton was asking, if you don't meet the test in March, but you do meet it in April, do you need to retest in May? The answer is no. You get a free pass on the, once you qualify once, if the program is still running, remember the program could be extended, which is another reason to get this stuff right. Once you passed the test once, you get a free month, or you basically apply for your amounts without having to retest for the revenue threshold.
Yeah, but you still have to apply every month. It's just
Oh,
you
absolutely.
have to do the financial test.
Yeah, and you have to calculate because your payroll might have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I see some questions about internal transfers, and there's a request here to repeat my instruction about the UCW. I think some folks have answered that as well. You have to determine whether UCW revenue, and I'm talking about when received. So if you're consolidating, if you take the view that UCW is part of your operation and that you consolidate UCW revenues in your annual T3010, then if the UCW had well, let's just say, my UCW used to have a geranium sale at the beginning of May. Okay, that's when the revenue counts. You may not be used to counting it then. You probably didn't even look at it until year end in the past, but you just have to figure out what their revenue streams are if you're including them.
On the other hand, if they had a geranium sale last year, Eric, and they're not doing this year because you can't do that in this climate, that'll show a revenue drop.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same. Frankly, a lot of their events would, even, in my church, hosting funerals and various things. So we're just working our way through the messages, trying to make sure that we get to as many as possible.
That doesn't mean including the UCW. It's any of the ancillary groups within the church who operate with their own funds.
Yes.
Yeah. I try not to complicate matters here, but where I would start is that what are the core operations of your church? It's so important to write it all down. Okay, you don't want to be sitting with a CRA auditor trying to either remember or make stuff up on the fly. Document every finding. I think I saw someone here who was down 29.4% in April. If that's your final answer, then I hope you pass the test in March so you don't have to worry about it. That would be my answer.
Yeah.
Just working my way through here.
Okay, so we've got a question from Deborah, Eric. And again, it's the question of what's the payroll for the minister? Is it her net pay? Is it the amount that ADP takes from the church account?
It's gross taxable pay. So it's basically what I would say box 14 or gross earnings. And the only adjustment from that would be a Mance situation. If you had I think there's specific codes there for Mance that you would need to subtract out because it goes into box 30 on a T4. But generally it's gross income. And certainly that's what we have ADP doing on our behalf for the 10% claim. And we should use the same approach.
Thank you. Not seeing a lot of extra questions come in, Eric.
Yeah.
I've noticed over on YouTube, there have been a couple of congregations who've received the $40,000 loan that we're not entitled to.
Right.
And their banks don't know what to do with it now because they want to give it back and the banks don't know how to take it.
Yeah, well, and I've said that last week. I guess I'll repeat it again. All of this happened so fast that if you talked to your local bank before applying, you probably got stopped or if you just fired something in online, like magically, I mean, when does $40,000 show up in your bank account because you sent an email? They literally haven't figured out how to give it back yet. So all you can do, I would say, is not spend it and wait a few weeks. And as soon as we hear anything, we'll get the word out to people as well. But right now, things are moving at such a clip, and I give the government credit for this, that the little exception things will get figured out later. And that's going to be one of the key messages as we close this webinar. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we're going to figure out later. One question I wanted to respond to, though, that I see here, that's a very good question, and I was kind of loose with my language. It's from James Smith. Eric, how do we draw on the ADP tax bucket for our employees not on ADP? So what I mean there is if you have some employees that perhaps you're taking CPP and EI, but not income tax, The only place you can go is wherever there is an income tax bucket, which might be on ADP. So in that situation, you would need to be submitting, you as the record keeper, you'd be submitting a tax, you do the calculation using the spreadsheet that's on the payroll website page. You'd use the tax adjustment form and you'd send that to ADP. And basically, you're taking full responsibility for the fact that you're reducing the income tax bucket. And ADP would need to process that the way they would if you were handling this with them or otherwise. So I hope that's clear. Okay, I'll keep checking the chat box, but let's move on. We've got a couple of slides to close things out here before I symbolically open my beer. So again, just governance, these wage subsidy applications, you can check with people for advice, but they don't require any kind of approval. You're the one doing the attestation. The senior official would normally be your treasurer or potentially an M&P or board chair or something like that. If there's any loan, and I keep saying any loan because I'm hoping the government will come through someday, but right now we're talking about the church loans. It's the congregation board. And there'll be some form of regional review that will be expedited. I guarantee you won't have to wait 2 months for some group to meet. There'll have to be a faster way than that. And online application by someone authorized to bind the applicant. That's the government's language when there was a government loan program, but we're certainly taking the view that if somebody sends us that email, we're authorized, that the congregation has authorized it. Okay, we're not going to be spending hours chasing copies of minutes and stuff like that. Next slide. So, because so many things are happening at once, it's inevitable that there'll be some duplication or errors in claims. Okay, it could be that some of you processed part of your 10% claim and then signed on with ADP. All of this will need to get reconciled. ADP, to the extent that they're doing the 10% for us, will give a final report to everybody. And ideally, it will add up to $1,375 per employee, however long it took. It might take 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months, depending on the size of the income tax bucket. The business of the 10% adjustment, okay, if you used an estimate, okay, you can adjust for that on the next claim. Okay, if there's a problem at all, again, document what you're doing. My advice is to go to the 10% worksheet, which is on the payroll webpage of the United Church, and then just document everything. As Clyde mentioned earlier, there are going to be folks abusing these programs. Or at a minimum, taking very aggressive interpretations of entitlements and so on. We don't want to be them. We want to be and be seen to be, acting in good faith through all of this. I think I might have one more slide there. I'm trying to remember. So, process the 10%. And again, we'll have this sign up possibility hopefully coming out tomorrow. Determine where you have 75% subsidy eligibility. So, you'll pretty soon, or you might be able to determine how the picture looks for you for April to April, for example. If you're eligible for the 75%, this is the most current and best advice. It's a little different from before. Use the CRA spreadsheet for the overall calculations. It's really, really good. Use the ADP church spreadsheet for the 10% adjustment, because you're trying to slot in the amount of the 10% for that specific time period. So there might have only been one pay in there. You might have even got, you need to figure out what you were entitled to in that time period, whether you claimed it or not. Okay, that's the wild card in all of this. The 75% worksheet assumes that you claimed it, and yet you've got all year to claim it if you want. File online by whichever method will work, and keep complete records for every filing. err on the side of over documenting. That will just show intent and due diligence and conscientiousness. And if you end up with a number like 29.4%, I would think that there might be some way of looking at the numbers to get it to 30, but if there isn't, you need to live with it. And if it was 29.6, I might feel differently, because you could round up to 30. So those are the comments in terms of what you could and should be doing right now. Every treasurer out there should play with the two spreadsheets. I mean, maybe I sound like a geek there, but they are quite friendly. They're well set up, and frankly, it shouldn't take hours of your time. Do we have another slide? So again, I list the contacts for various activities. I've been reprimanded by staff for not mentioning the deadline. So deferring monthly withdrawals, those happen on the 1st of the month. So we need to know that. If you were looking to defer June now, please let us know by mid-May, or at earliest opportunity. Susan Jackson is reminding us all to get our statistics in. She was reminding me because the two churches I work with, neither one has done that yet. So I plead guilty, and I suspect a few folks out there, it's pretty hard to worry about statistics with everything else that's going on. But that being said, the sooner the better. And here are the other contact information. And then we finish with a reminder that I'll have to get a new image for this next week, but we're in the same boat. And Steve, maybe you could close us with a few words of wisdom. And I will say thank you unless there are any further questions.
I haven't seen any other questions, and I think that's a really good sign. I think that people are getting a sense of what's involved here, and they're working at it. There's been a lot of conversation on the YouTube chat, and I've had a couple of extra eyes to look at that tonight, because things have moved a little more slowly for me, and they're answering each other's questions. So I think that there's a pretty strong sense of what you've been saying, and people are appreciating it and appropriating it. So thank you. Thank you for all of the work that you've done and put into this. What a difference it makes to know that you've got our back, and that you can help walk through this with us, because these are unprecedented times, as everybody keeps saying, and a lot rides on what our church treasurers do. Thank you to the two of you. Thank you to my colleagues who've been monitoring the YouTube chat and helping to answer the questions and not even throwing them over here. I've had a chance to watch Catherine Rudd and Aaron Gallagher at work tonight, answering questions and referring people to the info box at the General Counsel office. My goodness, yes, they're swamped too, but it's exciting to have a chance to connect this way with the church across the whole country. We will, of course, continue to do these webinars for as long as there's new stuff to report. And we're kind of hoping that maybe fairly soon there won't be. But we will be back next week, and look forward to seeing you at the same time and the same place. And Kendra, if Kendra is able to join us because there's new things to report there, terrific. Otherwise, bring your questions. Think about what's bubbling up for you as you try to implement some of the recommendations that you've received tonight. And if we don't have new information to respond to, then the agenda will be built next week out of the questions that you bring, and it'll be important to be clear and to address those as carefully as we can. Friends, thank you for joining us. And Eric and Clyde, I'm going to take you onto a breakout room again so that we can debrief together and you can actually open your beer. There was much discussion on YouTube about why you didn't do it earlier, and Kate Rod acknowledged that it's important for GC staff to be seen to be doing their work with sobriety all the time. So now that your work is finished, you're entitled to take a drink, and we'll give you that permission. Friends, thank you. We'll see you again next week. Bye for now.